I'm Mia Carter, 28, and 3 days ago I stepped off a plane from New York with my first photography award only to find every single thing I owned stuffed into cardboard boxes on the pier. After a night with almost no sleep, I kept adjusting the backpack on my shoulders so the trophy inside wouldn't bang around, telling myself I just needed to get home and talk to my aunt. She'd promised me a place in that building for as long as I needed it, but the last message from her read, "When you get back, we need to talk." I had no idea that the moment I rounded the corner, I'd walk into the kind of scene you only see in movies, except this one was aimed at me. If you've ever been blindsided by the person you trusted most, you're going to want to hear the rest of this. What would you have done in my place? It was April in my small coastal town in California. Early morning. The pier was quiet, the boards still damp from the night air. A few gulls circled overhead, and somewhere far out a bellbuoy clanged. I could smell the salt water mixed with diesel from the fishing boats and faintly coffee from the bait shop. My ride share had just dropped me off. I pulled my backpack onto my shoulder, careful not to jostle the trophy inside. It was wrapped in my sweatshirt, but I could still feel the metal edge pressing against my back. In my other hand, I carried a small paper bag with gifts, a silk scarf I'd picked out for Aunt Lillian in New York, and an enamel pin of the pier for my cousin Kevin. My shoes squeaked on the wet boards as I started walking. Winning my first photography award wasn't going to change the world, but it mattered to me. It meant someone else thought my work had value. I wanted Lillian to see that. I wanted her to understand this wasn't a hobby I'd grow out of. It was my life. The town looked the same as when I'd left. The bait shop's neon open sign buzzed. A teenage couple leaned against the railing with paper cups in their hands. A captain was spraying down the deck of his boat. The fog was thinning over the breakwater, and Old Man Harris sat on an overturned bucket, knotting a net without looking up. I walked past, nodding. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to check to know what was there. The last message from Lillian was still pinned at the top from the week before. "When you get back, we need to talk." I hadn't replied. I told myself it was probably about rent or the schedule for using the shared kitchen. But the truth was, the words sat in my mind like a small stone in my shoe. I kept walking toward the end of the pier where our building stood. My work life had been all hustle lately, shooting portraits for tourists, covering small events, editing late into the night, repairing my own equipment because repairs were too expensive. I'd taped my cracked lens hood before the trip because I couldn't risk losing the light on a windy day. My backpack felt heavier than it should have, and I adjusted the strap. Somewhere down the street, a siren wailed faint but sharp. My chest tightened. The sound pulled me backward in time. The last siren I'd heard that close was the one that took my parents away. I was 12. It had been hot, the asphalt shimmering under my sneakers. There were flashing lights, a tow truck idling, and a police officer kneeling in front of me. His voice was careful. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood enough. My mum's tote bag with sheet music had been set on the curb. My dad's camera strap, the one with his initials, was looped over it. Someone pressed a cold water bottle into my hand, but I couldn't drink. I remember the hospital hallway clock ticking and the sound in my ears turning thick like cotton. At the funeral, the wind came in from the ocean and tangled the black ribbons on the flowers. Photo boards of my parents leaned against the wall of the church. Lillian stood next to me in a practical coat, smelling faintly of lavender. She wrapped her arms around me and said in a low voice, "You will always have a home here." I nodded because I couldn't speak. That promise was something I held on to through every change that came after. A gull screamed overhead, and the memory broke. I was back on the pier, my fingers gripping the box with the scarf. The promise still echoed in my head, but it felt thinner now, stretched by years and arguments. I told myself people could change and still keep their word. The sun was just clearing the roof lines of the marina buildings. As I stepped off the pier onto the sidewalk, our building wasn't far. I pictured walking in, setting the trophy on the table, handing Lillian the scarf without making it a big speech. Just showing her, letting the work speak for itself. I shifted the backpack so the trophy wouldn't clang against the gifts. My phone vibrated again. I glanced down, saw the unopened thread from Lillian and slid it back into my pocket. I didn't need to open it yet. The morning was still calm. Whatever she wanted to say could wait a few more minutes. I kept walking. When I turned the corner and saw the end of the pier, I stopped. A row of cardboard boxes sat lined up along the railing. Some were sealed with duct tape, others half open, their flaps bending from the damp air. I could see the strap of my film camera hanging out of one, a tripod leg sticking out of another. My winter coat was bunched on top of a box, like it had been tossed there last. The edges of the boxes were darkened from the morning fog. My chest felt tight, like the air had thickened. These were my things, all of them. Every piece of gear I owned, clothes, personal stuff dumped out here for anyone to see. Lillian stood a few feet away, arms crossed. Kevin and Nick were behind her, one on each side, like they were blocking the way. None of them moved when they saw me. No smile, no hello. Just waiting. I walked up slowly, keeping my eyes on Lillian. "What is this?" I asked. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "You need to move out," she said. "Today." Her tone was flat, like she was reading a notice from the paper. Around us, a few people had stopped what they were doing. A woman holding a to-go coffee paused mid-sip. Old man Harris stood still, with a net in his hands. 2 fishermen leaned against a boat trailer, watching without pretending not to. It felt like I was standing in the middle of a public hearing I hadn't agreed to. "Why?" I asked. "It's time you were independent," Lillian said. "You're old enough to stand on your own. You can't live off other people forever." Her eyes didn't soften. She said it like she was doing me a favour. I blinked at her. "You could have told me before I left," I said. "You could have called." She looked past me toward the water. "Everything you own is here. You should start packing it into your car." "I don't have a car," I said. "You know that." Kevin shifted on his feet. "She sold it," he said, and then stopped like he knew he shouldn't have. Nick shot him a look that said, "Shut up." I turned to Kevin. "Sold? What, the building?" he said, before Lillian could cut in. "The studio, the apartment, everything." Lillian's voice snapped. "That's not your business, Mia." Her jaw was tight now. "This is about you getting your life together. You'll thank me one day." But the way the words came out, rushed and sharp, made it clear she wasn't in control of the story anymore. I could tell some of the neighbours had heard Kevin. Their faces had shifted from mild curiosity to something harder. I looked down at the boxes again. My first camera was in one of them, the one my dad had used. My hands curled into fists at my sides. My throat burned, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't going to fall apart in front of them. Not here. Not with everyone watching. "Fine," I said finally. "I'll go." I crouched and grabbed the nearest box. It was heavier than I expected, the bottom sagging a little. Something inside clanked, the sound of my spare lens hitting the side. The cardboard was cold and damp under my fingers. I straightened, turned away from them, and started walking toward the street. No one offered to help. Behind me, I heard the low murmur of voices, neighbours talking to each other, not to me. I didn't look back. I just kept moving, one heavy box at a time. I set it down beside a delivery truck at the curb and straightened up, breathing hard. My hands were shaking, not only from the weight, but from what was happening in front of everyone. I looked back toward the pier. Lillian stood with her arms crossed, saying something to Nick. Kevin nudged a coil of rope with the toe of his boot and kept his eyes down. Heat rose in my chest. I walked back to them. What about your promise to my mother? I said louder than before. And the years I paid to help with the bills. The roof, repair the electric, the plumbing, I paid for those too. Heads turned. The woman with the coffee stopped mid-sip. One of the fishermen muttered, "Not like this," and the other touched his elbow to quiet him. The bait shop owner pulled her kid a little closer to her side and glanced away. The air felt tight around us, like the whole pier had leaned in. "And what about the debt of raising you?" Lillian shot back. "I took you in. I fed you. I gave you a roof. I missed shifts to go to your school meetings. I put your name on my lease when no one else would. I covered you when gigs fell through. That is more than I ever got back." Her voice sounded rehearsed, each sentence clipped clean. I kept my eyes on her. 240 for the plumber. When the pipe burst in January, I said. 180 for the electrician after the short in the kitchen. Half of the roof patch last fall. 600 I sent from my savings. I have the email receipts. I can pull them up right now. I reached for my phone like I would actually show her, then stopped. I knew it wouldn't matter. Nick stepped in beside Lillian. "Adults pay rent on time every time," he said, looking past me like I wasn't there. Kevin shifted again. She does," he said, voice small. Lillian cut him a look and took a breath. "Your cousin just closed on a house," she said. "Your other cousin got promoted. They have plans, stability, and you're still running around taking pictures nobody needs." She said it like a fact, not an insult, but it landed the same. My jaw ached. My palms were damp on the strap of my backpack. I could feel my pulse in my neck. I told myself, "Don't give them a show." "That award in New York didn't just show up," I said. "I worked nights and weekends for years. I built a client list from nothing. I paid what I could when I could, and I always told you when money was tight. I've never asked you for a handout." Lillian tilted her head, eyes flat. "You're just a burden." The words were clean and fast, like she'd been waiting to say them. Someone in the small crowd drew in a quick breath. Another voice said softly, "That's harsh." The sound of water hitting the pier cut under everything. I stared at the nearest box and saw the corner of my dad's camera case. I wanted to fight every point. I wanted to unload the whole file of receipts and texts and the years of early mornings and late nights. But I could feel where that would go. More talking in circles, more public judgment, more of me standing there letting her define me. I bent down, grabbed the final box by the edges and turned away without answering. The cardboard flexed under my fingers, damp from the fog. I carried it to the curb and set it with the others, then pulled out my phone and opened the rideshare app. I picked the biggest option they had and dropped the pin by the pier entrance. The estimate said 8 minutes. A chat bubble popped up from the driver. "You have lots of boxes," I typed. "Yes," he replied. "Pull up to the green bench." I locked the screen and looked around. I needed a safe place for the boxes while I waited. I walked over to the bait shop window. "Can I set these here for a minute?" I asked the owner. "I've got a van coming." She looked over my shoulder toward Lillian, then back at me. "Just don't block the walkway," she said. "Thank you," I said, and slid them tight against the wall. I went back for more. I pushed the tripod leg back into a box and tied the strap so it wouldn't fall out. I opened my backpack, shifted the wrapped trophy deeper inside so it wouldn't clang, and zipped it. When I turned around, Lillian was closer. "You need to give me the keys," she said. For a second, I thought of the first day she handed me a copy years ago, with a smile that felt real. I unclipped the keyring from my belt, pulled off the studio key, and set it on the pier rail. "You can keep it," I said. She didn't answer. Kevin looked at the key and then at me but said nothing. I walked away to move the next box and my phone rang. "Sophie," I answered on the first ring. "Are you safe?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded steady, which surprised me. "Where are you?" "On the pier, by the bait shop," I said. "They put all my stuff in boxes outside. I called a van. It's 8 minutes out." I heard Tyler in the background say something, and Sophie came back on. "We're coming. Send me your exact pin. Can you bring duct tape and a couple trash bags? Maybe gloves," I said. "Some of the boxes are falling apart." "Already in my hand," she said. "Listen to me. Don't talk to them. Stay by your stuff. We'll be there in 10. "Okay," I said. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me," she said. "Text me the pin." I hung up and sent it. Then I looked down the line of boxes. Not just clothes and gear, yearbooks, old prints, the scarf my mother knit, the notebook where I keep location notes, all the small pieces that make up a life. I lifted another box, felt the bottom dip and slid a hand under it to keep it from tearing. The van driver called to say he was 2 minutes away. I told him I'd wave him down at the green bench. Behind me, the conversations on the pier had turned into a low hum again. No one stepped in. That was fine. I didn't want a scene getting bigger. I wanted out. The van rolled up and idled by the bench. The driver hopped out and opened the back. "You weren't kidding," he said, eyes wide, but then he got to work. We loaded fast. He took the heavier boxes. I stacked the lighter ones and slid them in tight. I left space for the last 3 near the bait shop wall. As we worked, Lillian stood back and watched. Nick checked his phone. Kevin hovered like he might say something. He didn't. When the last box was in, I closed the hatch and wiped my hands on my jeans. My phone buzzed again. Sophie. 2 minutes. I took one more look at the spot where I had set the key. It was gone. I felt nothing about that which surprised me too. I walked to the driver's window to confirm the address of Sophie's place and to ask if he could stop for a roll of tape on the way if we needed it. He nodded. No problem. I stepped back and called Sophie again. She picked up on the first ring. "We can meet you at my place," she said. "Tyler's clearing the spare room. I'll have coffee on. I'll see you soon," I said. I ended the call and stood there for a second breathing. Not just a place, a whole life. Okay. I climbed into the van and told the driver I was ready. 20 minutes later, we pulled up to Sophie's building, an older 3-story apartment with peeling paint but tidy flower pots by the entrance. Sophie was already outside waving. Tyler stood behind her, holding a roll of duct tape and a stack of folded trash bags. They didn't waste time with questions, just helped me unload box after box from the van and carry them up the narrow staircase to the 3rd floor. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. It hit me harder than I expected. After the cold and salt of the pier, the warmth here felt unreal. Sophie had cleared the couch in the living room for me. It was one of those fold-out beds, the kind that groans when you open it. Tyler had made space in the corner for a stack of my boxes. It was tight, but it was something. I thanked them both more than once. Sophie put a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to thank us. You just landed here. Breathe first." That night after dinner, Sophie asked if I wanted to talk about what happened. I gave her the short version, the boxes, the pier, Lillian. I didn't tell her everything Lillian had said. Tyler listened quietly, then said, "Focus on the next step. Don't let her live rent-free in your head." I nodded. The next morning, I opened my laptop at Sophie's kitchen table and started searching for a new place. I wanted a studio where I could work and live nothing fancy. I made a list of 5 possible spots from the rental sites. Then I looked at the prices and scratched off 3. Even the cheaper ones wanted rent that was nearly triple what I was making on a good month. Every listing had the same requirements: proof of income, at least 3 times the rent credit check, 2 months deposit. I checked my savings account. After the last few months, I didn't even have enough for the deposit. Around noon, I got a text from a client I'd done portraits for last year. They needed a photographer for a kid's birthday party, low pay, all cash. I said yes without thinking. I didn't have the luxury to say no. That first week was a blur. Between scanning rental listings, I took every small job I could get: a baby shower, an engagement party in a backyard, a community fair. I spent hours editing photos in Sophie's kitchen while she cooked dinner. I kept telling her I'd pay for groceries, and she kept saying, "Save your money, you'll need it." Inside, I was grateful, but also embarrassed. I was 28, sleeping on a friend's couch, living out of boxes. I did the dishes every night, took out the trash, made coffee in the mornings, anything to make myself less of an imposition. I could feel that Sophie and Tyler were adjusting for me. Tyler watched TV with headphones. Now Sophie did her workouts in the bedroom instead of the living room. I didn't want them to regret letting me stay. Halfway through the month, Sophie sent me a link to a small studio across town. North Light, she said. Perfect for photography. The rent was high, but the space had big windows and was close to the bus line. I told her I'd apply. I spent the evening filling out the form, attaching my portfolio and listing references. 2 days later, an email came back. We have decided to proceed with other applicants. The reason was simple: I didn't meet the income requirement. I read the line 3 times. It still felt like a punch. That night, I sat alone in the living room after Sophie and Tyler went to bed. The only light came from my laptop screen. My calendar for the next month was full of small jobs, but none of them would change my situation fast enough. I thought about the deposit. I didn't have the rent. I couldn't cover the fact that I couldn't keep living out of someone else's living room forever. I needed a bigger break. Something had to change. The next morning, I went to the thrift store 2 blocks from Sophie's apartment and bought a few things. I could afford: a folding chair for $10, a desk lamp with a slightly bent shade, and a wire rack to hang clothes on. They weren't much, but they let me set up a small work corner in the living room. I kept my receipts and started writing down every dollar I spent in a notebook. If I was going to make it, I had to watch every cent. A week later, my main camera jammed during a small job at a bakery. The shutter stuck halfway through and my stomach dropped. I didn't have the money to take it to a repair shop, so that night I searched YouTube for tutorials. I found one that used a simple toolkit, so I ordered a cheap set online. When it arrived, I spread everything out on the coffee table, watched the video twice, and followed every step slowly. My hands shook, but after an hour, the camera clicked back to life. I took a deep breath and let out a short laugh. At least I could fix something. Lillian's name started popping up on my phone every few days. Short messages, always the same tone. Still taking pictures of birthday cakes, or hope you're saving up for a real job. I never replied. I'd read them, feel the irritation spike, then put the phone face down. I told myself her voice didn't matter anymore, but some nights I still heard it in my head. Work was steady but small. I photographed a coffee shop for their new website, did headshots for a guy updating his LinkedIn, and covered a school fundraiser in a gym that smelled like old sneakers. The pay was low, but I kept my quality high. Every job was a chance for someone new to see my work. Still, the pressure was constant. My calendar was full, my sleep was short, and the apartment hunt hung over me like a deadline I couldn't meet. Some days I felt like I was running in place, working harder than ever, without getting closer to where I needed to be. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end introduced herself as the editor of the local magazine. She said she'd seen photos I took at the Summer Street Festival last year and wanted to know if I'd be interested in shooting their next cover. I almost dropped my phone. Yes, I said, probably too fast. Absolutely. After the call, I paced the kitchen for a full minute before sitting down and opening my laptop. I built a mood board with ideas for the cover, made a list of locations, and called 2 photographer friends to see if I could borrow extra lights. I treated it like the most important job of my career, because maybe it was. On shoot day, I got to the location an hour early. I checked the light, walked through the plan with the model and the makeup artist, and set up my gear. Halfway through, clouds rolled in, and the light shifted. I adjusted angles, bumped up the ISO, and added a reflector. The model was patient, and the team worked with me without complaint. By the end, I knew we'd gotten something good. Back at Sophie's, I loaded the shots onto my laptop and worked late into the night. I fine-tuned colours, balanced shadows, and sent a carefully edited set to the editor with a short thank you note. The next afternoon, she called back. "These are fantastic," she said. "Exactly what we needed. I'd like to work with you regularly." I sat there holding the phone, trying not to sound too relieved. "I'd love that," I said. After we hung up, I just stared at my desk lamp for a minute, letting it sink in. It wasn't a full solution to my problems. I still didn't have my own place, and I was still counting every dollar. But it was proof I was moving in the right direction. From the pier to Sophie's couch to this call, it wasn't everything I needed, but it was enough to keep going. 6 months later, I was in the small studio. I rent month to month a one-room space over a bike shop with a window that faced west. It was late morning. I was editing a wedding set for a client who wanted finals by noon. The room was quiet, except for my laptop fan and a drip from the old sink. At 9 to 12 a.m., my phone buzzed on the desk. I let it go. It buzzed again. I checked the screen and saw 5 unread texts, all from Lillian. The first one said, "You've turned your back on family." The next, "So this is who you are now." Then, "You think a magazine job makes you special." I put the phone down and went back to cropping a group shot. The export bar crawled. At 9:27 a.m., the phone vibrated 3 times fast. I tapped open the thread. Now there were 8. "You owe me a call. You've been disrespectful since you moved out. People are watching how you treat me." My stomach tightened. I muted the conversation and flipped the phone face down. I finished the color pass and started exporting the finals to a client folder. I emailed the download link at 11:58 and sent a short note. "Here are the selects. Let me know if you need any small changes." I got up to stretch and refill my water. When I sat down again, the phone lit up with more alerts. 12. 10 p.m. The count was 12. The tone had shifted a little. "We need to talk. I shouldn't have said some of what I said. Let's reset." I stared at the messages and didn't reply. I told myself I would not let this take up the day. I closed the blinds, halfway to cut the glare on my screen, and opened a new project for the magazine. At 1:00 p.m., there were 22 messages. New ones kept sliding in while I watched. "Call me, please. You don't know what you don't know. Stop being stubborn." I locked the phone and walked downstairs to the corner deli. I bought a turkey sandwich and sat on the curb for 5 minutes, just to breathe air that wasn't from my old vent fan. The phone buzzed in my pocket while I ate. I didn't check it. I went back upstairs and set up a small light test for an afternoon portrait. I needed to confirm my white balance with the new bulbs. At 2:10 p.m, the total hit 28. I scrolled and saw the language getting less sharp. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I miss you. We can figure this out." A memory hit me fast. Lillian handing me a copy of the key years ago saying, "Now you don't have to knock." I pushed it away and kept working. I cleaned my lens. I checked batteries. At 3:15 p.m, we were at 35. The texts were now mixed: 1 complaint, 1 soft plea, 1 warning. "You think you're better than us. Please, I just need to talk. You'll regret not answering." I typed a reply, "I'm at work," and deleted it before sending. I didn't want to open the door. I started the portrait session at 3:30 p.m. A local chef needed a simple headshot for a profile piece. While I adjusted a reflector, the phone buzzed again and again in my pocket. I ignored it, stayed on the subject, and got what I needed in 20 minutes. The chef left happy. I felt better for exactly 2 minutes. Then I checked the lock screen and saw 42. I didn't open any of them. I moved straight to culling the portraits. At 4:45 p.m, the thread jumped to 46. Now the messages were long, not one line. She wrote about bills she couldn't pay, a place she had to vacate by Friday, people who had stopped answering. She said she had been promised returns on an investment that never showed up. She said friends had turned their backs. I watched the dots move as she kept typing. I set the phone on the desk and went to wash my hands. The water was cold. I stared at my face in the mirror and told myself I didn't owe her a rescue. She had stripped me of a home in public without warning. I dried my hands, came back and kept editing. At 5:20 p.m, Sophie texted to check in about a weekend hike we'd planned. I told her I might be busy with edits and left it at that. I didn't want to start a long conversation over text about Lillian. At 6:02 p.m, the number hit 50. The tone was full-on pleading now. Please, pick up. I don't have anyone else. I made a mistake. I need your help. I put the phone on Do Not Disturb for 15 minutes and tried to cook a quick dinner on the hot plate eggs and toast. I burned the first slice. I ate standing up and went back to the computer. I delivered the chef's headshot at 6:40 p.m. and sent an invoice. At 7:10 p.m, 52. I'm sorry, please. Just call me for 2 minutes. My hands felt cold even though the room was warm. I walked to the window and watched the streetlights come on. Below me, a couple locked up the bike shop and rolled the metal gate into place. I came back, picked up the phone, hovered over the call button and put it down again. At 7:45 p.m, 55. This is serious. Please answer. I'm begging you. I remembered the day on the pier and her voice calling me a burden while everyone stared. I remembered setting the key on the rail and walking away. I told myself I could do that again. Choose silence. At 8:10 p.m, 56. I don't know where to go. At 8:19 p.m, 57. I made a bad decision. At 8:22 p.m, 58. This is an emergency. The word sat there by itself. At 8:30 p.m, 59. I've lost everything. I looked at that one for a long time. I thought of the day she signed the papers to sell the building and the way she had looked past me like I was a problem to be solved. I also thought of the funeral years ago, her hand on my shoulder, saying I would always have a home. 2 versions of the same person, and I didn't know which one was texting me now. At 8:37 p.m, 60. Please, Mia. I set the phone on the desk and sat back. My heart was beating too fast. I watched my email inbox for a minute to see if any client notes would pop up. None did. I told myself to concentrate on work. I tried to start a new selection for the magazine, but I clicked the wrong file twice and couldn't remember which folder I had just made. I stood up, stretched my arms and counted my breaths to calm down. I could block the number. I could call the police for a welfare check if I was worried. I could call Kevin and ask what he knew. I could do nothing at all. I didn't pick an option. I sat down again and typed out a draft reply. Are you safe? I stared at it, deleted it, and locked the phone. I turned it face down and slid it under my notebook so I wouldn't see the screen light up. The studio was quiet again. The battery in my desk clock ticked. I looked at the list of tasks pinned to my wall: edit magazine, feature, send invoice, charge batteries, backup drives. I moved my mouse and forced myself to do the smallest, rename a batch of files just to feel in control of something. It helped for about 30 seconds. I told myself I wouldn't get pulled into her crisis, that I had spent enough nights carrying her choices. Then I noticed my shoulders were tight and my thoughts were already spinning on what lost everything meant. Did she lose money? Did she lose the place she was staying? Did she lose every person who would pick up the phone? I didn't know, and not knowing was its own kind of pull. I pushed my chair back. refilled my water, took 2 sips, and came back to the desk. I didn't open the thread. I opened my calendar and checked tomorrow's scheduled morning shoot for a bakery afternoon, edits a quick call with the magazine editor about the next cover. I could keep my head down and do my work. I could do that tonight at least. I put in my headphones and turned on white noise to drown out the quiet. I edited 3 images and sent a proof to the editor. My phone stayed under the notebook. I didn't touch it, but every few minutes I glanced at the edge of the paper as if I could see through it. I told myself again I wouldn't get involved tonight. I also knew that by morning I would probably make a decision. One way or another I would have to. The next morning I packed my camera bag for a bakery shoot, 2 bodies of 50 spare batteries, extra cards, and boiled water for coffee. My phone started ringing on the counter. It was Kevin. He almost never called. I answered on the second ring. He didn't waste time. "Mia? It's about Lillian," he said. His voice sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard before. "She lost the money. All of it." I asked what he meant, and he laid it out in short pieces. After selling the building, she'd handed the bulk of the cash to a friend of a friend, a guy pitched by someone from her church group, promised quick returns paperwork that looked official. It was a scam. He was gone. The account was empty. When she realized it, she tried to pull money from a line of credit she'd opened to invest even more, but that just added fees and interest she couldn't pay. She had missed 2 payments on a short-term rental and was now in a highway motel near the edge of town paying night by night. Other relatives weren't picking up. Some were angry about the way she treated them before. Some were just done. "She asked me to call you," he said. I stood there holding my mug, not drinking. "What does she want?" I asked, though. I already knew. "To move in with you," he said, and then rushed on. "Just for a while," she says. "Until she figures it out." I stared at the wall. My first thought was the pier, the boxes, her voice telling me I was a burden. My second thought was the funeral and the way she'd held me and said I'd always have a home. Those 2 things fought in my head, and neither won. "How bad is it?" I asked. Kevin said she had maybe a week of money if she kept paying the nightly rate. She'd sold a few things for cash. She didn't have a car anymore. She'd let it go to cover bills. She had tried staying with a friend for 2 nights and was asked to leave after an argument. "I'm not defending her," he said. "She did you wrong. But she's at the bottom." I leaned against the counter and looked at my bag on the chair. I had 40 minutes before I needed to leave for the shoot. I asked Kevin if there was any chance the police could get the money back. He said a report had been filed, but the guy was already out of reach. Other people had been hit too. There might be an investigation, but it wouldn't help right now. "I can't have her live with me," I said, hearing my own voice steady even as my chest tightened. "My place is small. It's my workspace. And after what happened, I didn't finish." Kevin was quiet a beat. "I get it," he said. "I thought you should know, that's all." I asked where exactly she was staying. He gave me the name of the motel and the room number. I wrote it down on a sticky note and stuck it to the fridge. I asked if she was safe. "She's not sleeping much," he said. "She's scared. She won't say it, but she is." I pressed my thumb into the edge of the counter. Anger came up first, the public humiliation, the way she'd weaponized the word independence to push me out. Then something else came through, pity, or maybe just the memory of a person who had once helped me find my footing after my parents died. I hated that both things lived in me at the same time. If I say no, I asked, will there be anyone else Kevin didn't answer right away? Maybe she can get on a list for senior housing, he said. But that takes time. She needs somewhere to be until then. I thought about what letting her in would do to my life. The studio is small. My gear is everywhere. My schedule is tight. I finally have a rhythm. Bringing her into that space would change everything. I pictured my front door and felt my body tense like I was bracing for a hit. She could also try a shelter, Kevin said almost as a question, like, He knew how that would sound. "She won't go," I said. "You know she won't." We were both quiet. A car horn beeped outside and snapped me back. I checked the time. I had to leave in 20 minutes. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just didn't want you to find out from another 60 messages. If you want to ignore this, I get it. If you want to meet her, I'll tell her." I rubbed my eyes. "If I talk to her, it's on my terms," I said. "Not at my place. Not at hers. Neutral ground. And I'm not promising anything." "Okay," he said. "I'll tell her." I grabbed my camera bag and set it by the door. "I'll think about it," I said. "Text me later. I need to go work." "Mia," he said before we hung up, "I'm sorry about all of it." "Me too," I said and ended the call. I stood there for a second with the phone in my hand. The note with the motel name looked back at me from the fridge. I put the mug in the sink, slung the bag over my shoulder, and locked the door behind me. On the stairs, I told myself I was doing the right thing by not rushing in, that I had to protect the life I was building. The last time I let her in, it cost me my home. I wasn't sure I could afford the price again. The next morning, I texted Kevin, neutral place. Seabird Cafe by the beach, 3 p.m. Then I called Daniel. I told him I needed him to wait outside while I talked to Lillian. I explained the whole setup, short meeting, clear boundaries, no drawn-out drama. He agreed, said he'd be there 10 minutes early, and reminded me, "You don't owe her more than your boundary." We made a simple signal. If I touched my coffee cup twice in a row, he'd walk in and end it. At 2:50, I was sitting at a small wooden table near the cafe's front window. I'd chosen the seat, so my back was to the wall, and I could see the door and the sidewalk. The place smelled like espresso and salt air. Through the window, I could see people walking by, with beach towels over their shoulders. I had my phone out with 3 bullet points, written in a note: 1, not living together; 2, help find housing; 3, limited financial support. Daniel walked in, briefly leaned down to say, "You've got this," then went back outside to stand by his car, still in view. At 3:07, Lillian came in. She looked older than the last time I'd seen her. Her shoulders hunched, her hair unbrushed at the ends, dark circles under her eyes. She wore a faded coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. She scanned the room, spotted me, and walked over slowly. I stood just long enough to nod, then sat again. "Thanks for coming," I said. She sat down, clasped her hands on the table, and got straight to the point. "Can I stay with you for a while?" My voice was calm. "We're here to talk about options." "I can't offer that." She frowned like she'd been expecting me to fold. "It's just until I get back on my feet." "I understand," I said, "but I can't have you live with me." Her jaw tightened. "I pushed you out because you were stuck," she said. "You needed to be independent. Tough love. I wanted you to have more than this little town could give you." She went on about the sacrifices she'd made, how she'd raised me when she didn't have to, how my cousins had turned out more stable because they'd learned to take responsibility earlier. I let her finish without interrupting. When she stopped, I said, "You boxed up my life without warning. You put it out in public for everyone to see. That's not tough love. That's humiliation. I had to start over from nothing because of how you handled it." I kept my tone steady. Wanting the best for someone doesn't erase the damage you cause. She sighed, then shifted into her new story, how she trusted the wrong person, how the paperwork looked official, how she never thought it would go bad so quickly. "I'm sorry if I hurt you," she said, eyes darting away, "but I thought I was doing what was right." "I'm sorry this happened to you," I said. "It still doesn't change my boundary. I laid it out clearly. I won't let you move in with me. I will help you find affordable housing. I will help with the paperwork and even drive you to see places. I will give a fixed monthly contribution for 3 to 6 months, but not in cash, only through the landlord or a service. I will not co-sign anything, and I need us to limit calls and texts to certain hours. If you start attacking me, I'll stop helping." She leaned forward. Just a few nights. I'll cook, I'll clean. I raised you. No, I said. The terms I just gave are the only ones I can do. She sat back, exhaled hard. I took my phone out and opened a list I'd pulled from the city's website. Here's Pine Meadows Harbour View and the city's senior housing list. They all have wait lists, but some open spots monthly. We can apply to several at once to improve your odds. I slid the phone across so she could see. You'll need your ID, bank statements, and proof of any income. I'll cover the application fees. We can go together for the first appointment. I've already called Pine Meadows and they said Thursday morning is open. She stared at the screen, then nodded slowly. If that's what it takes, she said. It is, I said. One more thing I want us to do, family counselling twice a month while I'm helping you. If we're going to rebuild anything, it has to start there. She made a face, but after a moment she said, Fine. Just then, Daniel came in with a bottle of water. He set it in front of me and gave a polite nod to Lillian before stepping back out. His timing grounded me. I felt steady again. Lillian looked at me. When do we go back to normal? We won't, I said, but we can build something new if we both do the work. She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded once like she was accepting at least part of the truth. We agreed I'd send her the housing application links tonight and meet her Thursday morning to submit them. I stood, first signalling the meeting was over. We walked out together. Daniel opened the car door for me. You okay? He asked. Not yet, I said, but I will be. A year later, I was standing in my own apartment, a set of keys in my pocket that I'd bought with money I earned myself. The place was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, a little balcony, but it was mine, and it sat just a 10-minute walk from the beach. The morning light came in through the balcony doors, warming the white walls. I could hear the faint sound of waves if I left the sliding glass open. Getting here had taken every bit of discipline I had. I'd worked back-to-back photography jobs for months. Commercial shoots, events, a steady contract with the magazine that had given me my first cover. Every check that came in, I split living expenses, savings, and a growing house fund. I skipped trips, ate most meals at home, and bought second-hand whenever I could. The day I signed the purchase papers, the title company handed me the keys in a small envelope. I remember holding it in my hand, feeling the weight of it, and knowing that this was nothing like the last time I'd walked away from a home. This was walking in. When I moved in, Sophie and Daniel were my first helpers. Sophie carried boxes up the narrow stairs, while Daniel assembled the table I'd bought second-hand from a neighbour. We set up the couch along the far wall, angled so I could see both the TV and the balcony. I'd splurged on one thing, a small wooden bookshelf for the corner, where I put a mix of novels, photography books, and a framed print of my first award photo. Above the couch, I hung a picture I'd taken of the pier at sunset, not the day I was thrown out, but months later when the light made the water look like glass. It was a reminder that places can hold more than one meaning. The housewarming party was my way of marking the change. I invited close friends, a couple of neighbours I'd met, and a few colleagues from the magazine. The kitchen counter filled with dishes. People brought Sophie's spinach dip, Daniel's lemon bars, a platter of sliders from my editor. Music played low from a Bluetooth speaker. Laughter carried from the balcony to the living room. Daniel worked behind the counter, making simple cocktails, while Sophie showed guests around the apartment, pointing out my tiny but functional studio corner in the bedroom. At one point, a friend from the magazine asked, "So, how does it feel to have your own place?" I paused, looking around at the people scattered through the room, drinks in hand, talking like they belonged here. Safe, I said. Free. Like I can finally exhale. It hit me that, for the first time since I'd been an adult, my housing didn't depend on someone else's permission. The image of those cardboard boxes on the pier flashed in my mind, but instead of the hollow feeling I used to get, I felt a clean sense of distance. I slipped my hand into my pocket and touched the key. It was the same motion I'd made the day I was locked out, but now the key was to a door I could open whenever I wanted. Sophie caught me smiling at nothing and raised an eyebrow. "You're thinking about the pier, aren't you?" she said quietly when she passed. I nodded. And about how far it feels from here. We clinked glasses, without explaining more. Later in the evening, I found myself telling Daniel and Sophie that Lillian had been approved for a small subsidised apartment across town. She'd moved in 3 months ago. We saw each other maybe once a month, coffee, sometimes lunch, but always with boundaries in place. She hadn't asked for money outside of the agreed period, and I hadn't offered. Things were stable, but not close, and that was okay. Daniel lifted his glass. "To new beginnings," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "And to the homes we build ourselves." Everyone echoed the toast. I felt my chest warm not from the drink, but from knowing that this place, this moment, was something I had built from the ground up. As the night wound down, I stepped onto the balcony. The ocean air was cool, carrying the faint smell of salt. Down below the street was quiet, except for the sound of someone walking a dog. Inside, I could hear the low hum of voices, the clink of dishes being stacked in the sink. I wrapped my fingers around the railing and let the air fill my lungs. A year ago, I'd walked away from the pier, not knowing where I'd sleep next. Now I could turn around, unlock my own door, and step into a place that was truly mine. About a month after the housewarming party, I walked into Dr. Patel's office for one of the family therapy sessions I'd agreed to do with Lillian. The room was small but comfortable soft chairs arranged in a semicircle, a table with tissues in the middle and warm yellow light coming from a lamp in the corner. Dr. Patel greeted us both, asked how we'd been, and then said, "Today we'll talk about progress and things you'd like to acknowledge." I didn't expect much from the session. Most of our meetings had been awkward, full of pauses with Lillian keeping her guard up. But this time, she took a slow breath, looked down at her hands, and then said, "I'm proud of you, even though I was the cause of your pain." Her voice was unsteady, and for a second I thought she might cry. It was the first time she'd said anything like that. I froze for a moment. There was a time when I would have given anything to hear those words from her. I remembered being a teenager, craving even the smallest sign that she saw me, valued me. Now sitting in that chair, I felt something else, a strange mix of relief and distance. I didn't feel that flood of validation I used to imagine. Instead, I felt grounded in a way that made me realize I no longer depended on her approval to know my worth. I took a breath before I spoke. "Thank you. That means something," I said, keeping my voice even. "But I've learned to be proud of myself first." Lillian looked at me, her eyes flicking up for just a moment before dropping again. She gave a small nod. Her face was hard to read, part regret, part release. Dr. Patel glanced between us, making a note in her folder. "That's a significant step," she said. "How do you both want to move forward from here?" I leaned back slightly, thinking about how far things had come. We were no longer in open conflict, but we weren't close either. The idea of trying to force things back to what they were before didn't appeal to me anymore. Lillian spoke next. "I used to think pushing you out was the only way you'd grow. I told myself it was for your own good. But really, I think I was scared. Scared of losing control, scared of being left behind." She shook her head slowly. It was the wrong way to handle it. I listened without interrupting. A year ago, I would have jumped in to argue or demand more. Now, I just let the words land. "I can't change what happened," she continued. "But I don't want us to be strangers." I nodded once. "We don't have to be. But we do have to keep things healthy. Respect and boundaries, that's the priority." "I can do that," she said quietly. There was a moment of stillness after that. The tension in the room felt lighter, like we'd both let go of something heavy. Dr. Patel asked us to each name one thing we appreciated about the other. Lillian said she admired my work ethic and the way I'd built a life for myself. I said I appreciated that she'd been willing to come to these sessions even when they were uncomfortable. When the hour was up, we both stood. We didn't hug. Instead, we shook hands, a simple, mutual gesture that felt right for where we were. Outside, the air was crisp. I walked to my car feeling lighter than I had at the start of the hour. Her pride no longer defined me, but hearing it, even this late, still mattered. After the session, I drove home along the coast. The sun was lowering the sky, glowing orange and pink, and the sight of the water brought back a flood of memories I hadn't touched in a long time. When I got home, I went straight to the storage cabinet in my bedroom and pulled out a cardboard box I hadn't opened in years. Inside was a stack of old photo albums and loose prints. I sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through them slowly. There were only a handful of photos with my parents, but each one carried a sharp, clear feeling. I remembered a summer picnic in the park, my dad carrying me on his shoulders, my mom spreading out a red checkered blanket. I could almost smell the sunscreen and hear their laughter. Another memory surfaced a winter night when all three of us were watching a movie in the living room. I fell asleep halfway through, and when I woke up, I was in my bed, tucked in under my favourite blanket. Those moments had been so simple, but they were pure, unconditional love. The next set of photos showed the early years with Lillian. I saw her younger, more energetic, holding my hand on the first day she walked me to school. One picture was of us in the kitchen covered in flour after baking cookies. Another was from a rainy afternoon when she read me a story while I sat wrapped in a towel after a bath. Back then, it felt like I still had a home. As I kept turning the pages, the shift was clear. The smiles faded, replaced by more formal pictures or group shots where we stood apart. I remembered how the tone in the house had changed. Encouragement turned into comparisons, support became criticism. By the time I was in my late teens, we were speaking less and arguing more. Still looking at these photos, I realized something important. Family isn't just where you're born. It's the people who treat you with love and respect, whether they share your blood or not. That's a truth I had learned the hard way. Sophie and Daniel had been more of a family to me than some people I was related to. My colleagues who showed up for my housewarming, the neighbours who checked in on me, these were my chosen family. Around this time, I got an email from a non-profit that worked with teens who had lost their families. They were starting a project to help the teens tell their own stories through photography. One of their volunteers had recommended me as a mentor and lead photographer. I said yes right away. At first, I treated it as just a volunteer project, but after the first workshop, I knew it was going to be more. The group was small, 7 teens between 14 and 17. We started with basic lessons, how to hold a camera frame, a shot use natural light. I gave them simple assignments like taking a portrait of someone in the group. During one of the breaks, a quiet girl named Kayla looked at the portrait another student had taken of her and said softly, "This is the first time I feel seen." The words hit me hard. I excused myself for a moment, stepped into the hallway, and let out a long breath. That one sentence brought back the years I'd felt invisible in my own home. I went back in determined to make sure every one of them felt that same recognition. Over the weeks, I watched them open up. Their photos became bolder, more personal. We talked about framing light and shadow, but also about the stories behind their images. I realized this work was healing me too. Every photo I took with them, every story they shared, filled a part of me that had been empty for years. It felt like I was carrying forward what my parents had given me care without conditions. At the end of the project, we held a small exhibition at the community centre. The teens invited friends, foster parents and mentors. As I stood in the back watching people admire their work, I felt a quiet pride, not the kind that depends on someone else's approval, but the kind that comes from knowing you've helped build something meaningful. That night, back in my apartment, I looked at the group photo from the exhibition. They were all smiling, some holding cameras, others holding hands. I thought, this is the family I choose to stand with. A few weeks after the exhibition, I woke up early on a Sunday with no plans. The weather was cool and the sky clear, so I decided to walk down to the old pier. I hadn't been back there alone since the day I left with my things in boxes. The streets were quiet that early, just a few joggers and a couple walking their dog. When I reached the pier, the boards creaked under my feet, just like they always had. The smell of salt water and the sound of waves hitting the pilings filled the air. I stood at the railing, looking out at the same stretch of ocean I'd seen 1,000 times before. For a moment, I glanced at the exact spot where my boxes had been stacked. I remembered standing there with my heart pounding, unsure where I'd sleep that night. The memory was sharp, but it no longer hurt. I could think about that day without feeling anger or shame. It was just something that had happened, and it had brought me here. I stayed still, listening to the waves and the faint calls of seagulls. The air felt clean in my lungs, and there was a calm in me I hadn't known back then. I realized that losing my old home had forced me to build something better. If I had stayed there, protected but controlled, I might never have found my own strength. I thought about the apartment I had, now the work I was doing with the teens, the friends who filled my life with warmth. That wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been pushed out. I understood now that home isn't just walls and a roof. It's a feeling of belonging and respect. It can be found with people you choose, not just the ones you're born to. I leaned on the railing and watched the water below. A group of kids ran along the dock and jumped into the ocean laughing as they splashed each other. I watched them swim away from the shore, confident and unafraid, and I couldn't help but see my own journey in theirs. At one time, I had been terrified to leave the sand, but now I knew how to move through deeper water. After a while, I turned and began walking back toward town. My steps felt steady, unhurried. The pier was behind me, but the ocean was still in view. I didn't need to come back here to remember where I'd started, but it felt good to close the loop. Sometimes being pushed off familiar sand is the only way to learn how to swim into open waters.